In this episode, we're going to connect two ideas that beginners often see as separate: policy compliance and continuous monitoring. Policies are the organization's written expectations about how systems should be operated and protected, while continuous monitoring is the ongoing practice of checking whether those expectations are actually being met as the environment changes. Many organizations are good at writing policies and weak at maintaining compliance, because compliance tends to decay quietly over time through configuration drift, changing staff, new systems, and the pressure to deliver quickly. Continuous monitoring is how you keep policies from becoming shelf documents, because it provides evidence that controls are working and that deviations are discovered early rather than after an incident. The goal is not to create constant surveillance of people. The goal is to maintain visibility into system conditions that matter for security posture. By the end of this lesson, you should understand what continuous monitoring means in practice, how it supports ongoing compliance, and how to make monitoring produce useful signal without overwhelming teams. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Policy compliance means the organization's systems and processes align with agreed expectations, such as access being limited appropriately, sensitive data being protected, logging being enabled, and changes being reviewed. For beginners, it can be tempting to treat compliance as a checklist that gets completed during an audit, but real compliance is a condition that must hold continuously to reduce risk. Policies exist because they represent decisions about what level of safety is acceptable, and when systems drift away from policies, the organization's risk posture changes without anyone necessarily realizing it. Continuous monitoring matters because modern environments are dynamic, especially in cloud settings where systems can be spun up quickly, modified frequently, and integrated with new services on short timelines. In such environments, a quarterly review may be too slow to catch harmful drift, and policy compliance becomes a periodic illusion rather than a stable reality. Continuous monitoring reduces that gap by turning compliance into a living process that checks critical expectations regularly. When done well, monitoring makes compliance less stressful because problems are identified earlier, when they are smaller and easier to fix. Continuous monitoring is the practice of collecting, analyzing, and acting on signals about the security state of systems over time. It is continuous not because someone stares at a screen every second, but because the organization maintains an ongoing ability to detect deviations and respond. A key beginner misconception is that monitoring is only about detecting attacks, but continuous monitoring for policy compliance is often about detecting conditions that increase risk, such as overly broad access, weak configuration settings, missing logging, or unapproved changes. Monitoring for compliance therefore focuses on control health, meaning whether the controls that policies require are present and functioning. It also focuses on drift, which is the gradual erosion of baseline expectations as changes accumulate. Continuous monitoring turns policy compliance from a one-time declaration into a measurable state that can be maintained. It also provides the evidence that leaders and auditors often want, but the primary purpose is operational, keeping the environment safe and stable. To ensure ongoing compliance, you first need to translate policies into monitorable requirements, because vague policies cannot be monitored reliably. A policy that says systems must be secure does not tell you what to measure, while a policy that says privileged access must require multi-factor authentication, MFA, can be monitored by checking whether privileged accounts are protected appropriately. Similarly, a policy that says critical systems must log administrative actions can be monitored by checking whether logging is enabled and whether expected events are being produced. Beginners sometimes assume policies are naturally measurable, but many policies are written at a high level, and operational compliance requires turning them into concrete control statements. This translation process is where you decide what evidence will prove compliance and what deviation looks like. When policies are mapped to measurable control conditions, monitoring becomes possible and enforcement becomes fair because expectations are clear. Without this mapping, monitoring becomes inconsistent and teams argue about what compliance really means. A practical continuous monitoring practice also begins with prioritization, because monitoring everything equally will overwhelm the organization and produce noise. The best starting point is monitoring the policy requirements that protect the most critical assets and the most sensitive data. For example, monitoring privileged access controls and key identity settings often provides high value because access weaknesses can create broad compromise. Monitoring logging and visibility requirements provides value because visibility is essential for detection and investigation. Monitoring configuration baselines for critical services provides value because baseline drift is a common pathway to exposure. Beginners sometimes think monitoring should begin with the easiest things to measure, but the better approach begins with the most important things to protect, then expands as the program matures. Prioritization ensures monitoring produces actionable signal rather than an endless stream of minor deviations. It also helps teams focus their remediation effort on what truly changes risk posture. To make monitoring effective, you need clear thresholds and response expectations, because monitoring without response is just observation. A threshold is a definition of when a condition becomes a compliance issue that requires action, such as an account missing required protections, a system lacking required logging, or a configuration deviating from baseline. Response expectations define who is notified, how quickly action must occur, and what closure looks like. Beginners often assume that once monitoring detects a deviation, the problem is solved because it is known, but knowledge without action does not reduce risk. Response expectations are what turns detection into risk reduction, because they ensure deviations are corrected, exceptions are managed deliberately, and recurring patterns are addressed at the process level. A disciplined program also differentiates between urgent deviations that require immediate attention and lower-risk deviations that can be handled in normal maintenance cycles. This differentiation prevents monitoring from creating constant panic, which would lead to alert fatigue and avoidance. When thresholds and response paths are clear, continuous monitoring becomes a calm, steady mechanism for maintaining compliance. Another key part of continuous monitoring is maintaining asset context, because policy compliance depends on what a system is and how it is used. A control requirement for a critical production system may not apply in the same way to a low-impact test environment, and treating them the same can create unnecessary work. At the same time, test environments can become risky if they handle real data or if they provide pathways into production, so context must be accurate, not assumed. Continuous monitoring should therefore use asset classification and criticality to interpret deviations appropriately and to route them to the right owners. This avoids a common failure where monitoring produces thousands of findings that no one can prioritize, which causes teams to ignore the system entirely. When monitoring output is contextualized, teams can see why something matters and what to do first. This also supports leadership reporting, because leaders can see compliance posture for critical assets rather than a blended average across everything. Continuous monitoring also needs to account for the reality of change, because many compliance deviations occur during or after changes. A system might be deployed without the correct logging settings, or a change might accidentally widen access privileges, or an update might alter default configurations. Monitoring should therefore be integrated with change control practices so that new systems and significant changes are checked for compliance as part of their life cycle. This reduces the chance that non-compliant systems enter production and remain there unnoticed. It also reduces friction because teams can expect compliance checks as part of release readiness rather than experiencing them as surprise findings weeks later. In cloud environments especially, where deployments can be frequent, integrating monitoring into the change rhythm helps maintain baseline posture as systems evolve. This is how continuous monitoring supports both compliance and delivery speed, by catching deviations early when they are easier to fix and by making expectations predictable. A common challenge in continuous monitoring is avoiding noise, because too much noise leads to alert fatigue and loss of trust. Noise can come from poorly defined policies, overly broad monitoring rules, lack of context, or lack of prioritization. It can also come from measurement errors, such as false positives, incomplete coverage, or inconsistent data sources. A mature monitoring practice invests in tuning, meaning adjusting what is monitored and how it is interpreted so that the output remains actionable. Tuning includes refining thresholds, improving asset classification, and ensuring that monitoring focuses on the controls that most affect risk posture. It also includes tracking the quality of the monitoring system itself, such as whether it is missing critical assets or producing inconsistent results. Beginners sometimes assume monitoring systems are objective and self-correcting, but monitoring requires ongoing improvement just like any other security process. When tuning is done well, monitoring becomes a trusted source of truth rather than a source of constant distraction. Another essential aspect is handling exceptions properly, because real organizations sometimes must deviate from policy for operational reasons. Continuous monitoring can reveal those deviations, but the program must decide whether they are acceptable and under what conditions. If exceptions are unmanaged, they become permanent drift and erode compliance over time. A disciplined approach treats exceptions as time-bounded decisions with clear owners, documented rationale, and compensating controls where appropriate. Monitoring should track exceptions as part of compliance posture, because an organization with many exceptions is often carrying more risk than it realizes. Monitoring should also support review of exceptions so they do not outlive their purpose, which is a common failure when operational pressure is high. Beginners sometimes think exceptions mean the policy is failing, but exceptions can be a normal part of risk management as long as they are visible and controlled. The key is that an exception should never be invisible, because invisible exceptions are hidden risk. Continuous monitoring also supports assurance, which is the ability to provide confidence to leadership that controls are not only defined but functioning. Assurance matters because leadership decisions about risk acceptance, budgeting, and priorities depend on whether leaders believe the environment is under control. Continuous monitoring provides that confidence by producing steady signals about compliance status, trend, and areas of persistent deviation. A strong program reports compliance posture in a way that is understandable, such as showing whether critical control requirements are met on critical assets, how long deviations remain unresolved, and whether deviation rates are improving or worsening. This reporting should avoid implying that perfect compliance is possible, because real environments contain complexity and change. Instead, reporting should focus on whether the organization is maintaining compliance on what matters most and whether deviations are being corrected within expected timelines. When leaders see that compliance is actively managed rather than passively hoped for, they are more likely to support the resources and process improvements needed to sustain it. Over time, continuous monitoring can also drive improvement by revealing recurring patterns that indicate deeper problems. If the same type of deviation appears repeatedly, such as missing logging on new deployments, that suggests a baseline configuration issue or a deployment process gap. If access privileges repeatedly become too broad, that suggests a role design issue or an access review weakness. If policy compliance is high on some teams and low on others, that suggests inconsistent ownership or inconsistent process adoption. Monitoring transforms these patterns into evidence, which makes it easier to improve processes rather than blaming individuals. In cloud security environments, where automation plays a major role, these patterns often point to where secure defaults and templates must be improved so compliance becomes automatic. This is where continuous monitoring becomes more than a detection tool. It becomes a feedback mechanism that helps the organization mature. When organizations use monitoring this way, compliance stops being an after-the-fact correction and becomes a steady trajectory towards stronger baseline posture. As we bring this lesson together, ensuring ongoing policy compliance through continuous monitoring practices is about maintaining visibility into control health as the environment changes. Policies must be translated into measurable requirements so monitoring can detect meaningful deviations, and monitoring must be prioritized so it focuses on the controls that protect critical assets and sensitive data. Thresholds and response expectations turn detection into action, while asset context prevents noisy reporting and supports fair prioritization. Integration with change control catches deviations early, tuning reduces alert fatigue, and disciplined exception handling prevents drift from becoming permanent. Continuous monitoring provides assurance to leadership by showing trend and by making compliance posture visible and manageable. Most importantly, Continuous monitoring supports improvement by revealing recurring patterns that can be addressed through better baselines and processes. When these practices are in place, policy compliance stops being a periodic scramble and becomes a reliable, operational habit that protects the organization's security posture day after day.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.